Cheers, guys. Epix 911. Welcome to this VR hardware episode. We're going to talk about the Oculus Touch controllers. Had these things for about a week and a half now and have done a barrage of tests with them, on them, surrounding them, you name it. I've probably tested it. Thanks in no small part to Xlord B, one of the viewers of this channel. He's got the Oculus Rift, had a bunch of issues, ran through pretty much most of the testing that he did on his so that I could replicate it on mine and see if those same issues occurred. Now, I'm going to cover three general categories. We're going to talk about ergonomics. We're going to talk about tech-specific features that this controller brings to the table. And then thirdly, probably weighted most important, we're going to talk about tracking and how important tracking is. Now, for me, the best way to do that is to try to make it as unbiased as possible, but weighted as equally as possible. Here's an example. There are games native to one that you need a workaround to play on the other. For example, playing a native Rift game with your touch controller, then testing against that, playing the same game but using an application like Revive to play it on your Vive controllers. I don't think that's a fair way to go about it. You're going to have difficulty separating issues native to Revive versus issues that really truly exist on that software. So wherever possible, I pick games native to both, and even took that one step further and tried to find games that were natively developed on either software platform, meaning a game like Arizona Sunshine, Steam VR game, Arizona Sunshine, Oculus Rift game. It's also available on their store. Space Pirate Trainer, another example of that. So yeah, there was a barrage of testing there. I did the testing with two cameras, one camera, two cameras, without extension, with extension. And these are basically the results of those findings. So let's get into it. Let's start with the first category, guys, ergonomics. Now, I've said this before. My wife loves to tease me about my hands. She calls them club hands. She calls me some other choice names. We don't need to get into that. But club hands with thick digits, which admittedly I do have. And it makes gloves, controllers, a pain in the arse. So how did the touch controllers fare for me? They actually fared pretty damn well. They are extremely ergonomic. In fact, compared to the Vive controllers, I would say these were many times more comfortable than the Vive controllers. You guys know I love my Vive controllers, and they are absolutely functional, but when it comes to feel and ergonomics, the touch has them beat, absolutely hands down. Now, I'm just going to put these down here again. The one first consideration when we're talking about ergonomics, and this is an important factor, a lot of people don't think about this, is when you pick up a touch controller, they are left or right hand specific. In other words, you pick up a Vive, it doesn't matter if it's with your left hand or your right hand, they're interchangeable. It's a Vive controller. You can also purchase them one at a time on the store. Albeit pricier, absolutely, than their touch counterparts, it is an option for you. With the touch controllers, for example, let's say you had a hardware issue with one of them and they failed. At least up until the making of this video, you only have the ability to buy these controllers in pairs. In other words, you couldn't buy just a left-handed replacement or just a right-handed replacement. You would have to purchase a set, a pair, right? May not be a huge deal. They may never fail, and you'll never have to come across that. I pointed out as it could be a factor for some of you. So ergonomics, hands down, I think it has it beat. If I could make one small quibble about these, it would be the shaft, the hilt, as it were. If it was just 3/4 of an inch, so 2 centimeters longer, it would have been perfect just to give support for those with bigger hands near the bottom of the controller. But really, the majority of the grip is near the ends of your fingers and the upper area of your palm anyways. It's not huge, like I said, minor quibble, that would be it. All right, So in terms of ergonomics, pretty much established if you're keeping a scorecard. And to me, it's about the game and experience. I don't need to beat that to death. But of course, that doesn't mean I don't have opinions on what's more comfortable in a given situation or what's going to allow me to get the best game experience. So ergonomics, touch. Now let's talk about tech specific features. So when we talk about the Vive, the trackpad would be a tech specific feature unique to the Vive controller. With this, you can do all kinds of cool stuff. You can do mouse style movement. For example, playing Doom 3 with its free range locomotion, this is a very adequate, I would even say good substitute for mouse and keyboard. Is it as good? Of course not. Nothing actually beats the mouse and keyboard, but it's very damn good and it's a good second and my choice way of playing Doom 3 on my HTC Vive. What does the touch bring to the table? Well, the touch brings gesture support to the table. And we've talked on my news episodes the last few days about exactly that. Haptic feedback devices like the high five gloves that have finger support, gesture support, grabbing with a full hand as opposed to a pinch grab, etc. The touch controllers likewise have gesture support. So, for example, your middle finger on the trigger, index finger on the trigger, and then lay your thumbs down across the buttons. Feels like a fist, closed-handed fist. In-game, that's exactly what it is. Your in-game avatar will have a fist. You can use that in boxing games, FPS games where you have no weapon and you're going hand to hand. When you're mimicking in real life what's happening in the game, it just adds to the immersion, in my opinion. The next gesture, and there's a few, I'm going to have some pictures. I'm just going to touch on the main ones. The next one would be that same grip, except just lifting your thumb. That's a thumbs up. Put your thumbs back, do the same with your pointer index finger. And now you are pointing. That seems like such a minor freaking thing. So what, you're pointing epics. But for irresistible things in games, like buttons, let's face it, we all want to push buttons. Having the finger gesture just feels so natural. Like I said, minor aesthetically on the surface of things, but when you actually get used to using your finger to push on stuff, and then you go back to the Vive controller, there's definitely something missing. So, those are the main ones. There's other ones. There's kind of like the Chef Perfect gesture as well. I would say there's enough gestures that if you wanted to do a quasi sign language and, military style in a game like Onward, you could do that with the touch controllers, with your buddies. Absolutely. So, which do I prefer? I'm gonna go out and say it's probably a tie in terms of what each brings to the table. I love the gestures, but then I love the trackpad. So where I give ergonomics to the touch, I'm gonna just say it's pretty much a draw for tech specific stuff that they bring to the table. You've got that capacitive surface that to some degree can mimic certain functions of the trackpad, but it's not quite as flexible, and vice versa. You could do things with the Vive gesture-wise, but it wouldn't be as natural, as organic, as fluid. Here's the big one, guys, and no doubt the most controversial is going to be tracking. But we got to cover tracking because tracking is super important. Now, the first thing I wanted to put to frickin' rest was this insistence by some, it's a small resistance pocket, if you will, on the Rift side of the equation that two front-facing cameras are all you need for 360. Well, geometry and logic would dictate that no, there's going to be way too much occlusion for 360. And of course, my tests bared that out. There's too much occlusion. You cannot do 360 with two front-facing cameras. Now, I need to stress that. Some people are going to hear that, and they're going to say, he says it can't do 360 with two. No, it can. Just not if they're front-facing. What you want to do is you want to place the cameras diagonally, or one in front of you, one behind you. Now, let's talk about default tracking with the two sensors in terms of rug scale first. With two cameras, playing a game like Space Pirate Trainer, There is absolutely no problem with tracking. The tracking on the touch is good, very good. It's fluid. You can shake it, do all kinds of things. It's hard to lose that tracking by default, especially in Space Pirate Trainer. Some have noticed since the last update some issues with that tracking. And indeed, there are some applications, likely probably software specific in my opinion, because you can pick other applications and those same issues just don't appear. That was my experience with Space Pirate Trainer. It was solid, absolutely solid. Now, what about 360-degree? Room scale style. Now, Oculus themselves recommend 3 cameras for their highest quality room scale experience. There's a reason for that. Let's say with the Vive controller, okay, percentage wise, measured against perfect tracking. Let's say perfect tracking is 100%. I would put the Vive controllers at about 85 to 95%. More often 90 to 95. That's where I'd place these. When you have everything calibrated, it's pretty much a no-brainer with the Vive. You just play. You don't play and pray, you just play, right? Things work, and you get used to that working. With the Oculus Touch, setup time is quite a bit more fussy. For example, trying to set up the touch controllers on Steam VR was an exercise in absolute frustration and patience for me. It was super annoying and way more involved than it needed to be. That same setup for room scale type and Guardian on the Oculus side of things, absolutely seamless, worked fine. So again, a software issue, not a hardware issue. It's just Steam VR, unlike Oculus, it's not natively supporting that controller. It's compatible, but not natively controlling it, and it shows in areas like setting up. So, Arizona Sunshine was the game that I did the majority of my apples to apples 360 testing with. Initially, I didn't use a USB 3 extension cable. And what I did was set up the cameras. Look, front to back like that is pretty much impossible. You can really only pull off diagonal, and I didn't find it was perfect diagonal. In other words, you were off center just enough to create more occlusion than if you had the extension cable. So percentage wise, I would say if 90 to 95% is the Vive, I was about 65 to 75% with the touch with no extension. Soon as I got a USB 3.0 extension cable, that went up considerably. Still not as good as the Vive though, but it was good. If you'd never used the Vive ever, you'd be perfectly happy using 360 on the touch with an extension cable. No probs at all. The difference for me was having used the Vive a lot the last 6-7 months. Okay. Now, front to back, I found works about as good as diagonal if they're set up properly. And that getting that sweet spot compared to the Lighthouse setup with the sweeping lasers is a bit fussier. Even through Oculus software, it's still a bit more fussy to get that sweet spot where the tracking just works, okay? So with the extension cable front to back or diagonal, optimally laid out, having done all that calibration, I would say you're probably looking at 80 to 90% tracking versus the Vive. I think if you were to go to 3 cameras like they recommend themselves for the best experience, you would easily be as good as the Vive, potentially better, because you would reduce the occlusion even further against the Vive. I just think the Vive sweeping laser versus the camera has enough of a difference in terms of its, wide angle range or top to bottom range that those few percentage points where I put the Vive higher are a direct result of the technology. So end result, guys, for that with the touch controllers, for me personally, they work fantastic. If you're keeping score, ultimately, I would say it's a draw, but that depends on how, you weight the different variables. Excuse me. If tracking is the most important thing for you, the Vive wins. If tracking is, not really a consideration because you're doing rug scale 180 and room scale is not your cup of tea, won't even factor in. Touch wins in that case, because then it's about ergonomics, it's about those specific features. So those are the considerations for me. Those were my findings. Of course, your mileage is going to vary. It's a objectively subjective or subjectively objective thing. It's going to vary. But those were my findings. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. If you want to know more test specific stuff, I'm going to include in the descriptions the games that I tested. There was no point for me testing stuff like cockpit games that were, controller specific to controllers other, because the whole point is testing the touch. And yeah, ultimately, I love them. I'm happy that I have them. Now, let's just talk about some real quibbles, kind of minor quibbles. What I did notice when I would have those instances where the tracking was less than optimal, those few percentage where it was off from Vive, it would be stuff like my controller for one hand would just stay suspended in the air and it wouldn't resync immediately until I was back in camera range for a few hundred milliseconds or a few seconds, and then it would snap back in. There were other times where the movement was janky. In other words, wasn't in line, but most of those were due to occlusion or software. I think through programming, they can make that as tight as the hardware will allow it to be, and you would probably not notice much of a difference between it and the Vive at that point. So, pros and cons, guys. Let's just kind of do a final sweep. So, pros, ergonomic, hand gestures, Oculus home configuration, very intuitive. Now, non-rechargeable batteries. I put that as a pro and a con. Normally you'd say that cancels, they cancel each other out, but it's worth talking about. Non-rechargeable batteries, pro means if you have a fresh pair of batteries in there, you are always going to get that advertised high duration charge. With rechargeable batteries, over time, from full recharge discharge cycles, your maximum theoretical charge time possible diminishes over time. That's a for sure thing, not up for debate. It happens with lithium-ion batteries. So the pro there is if you've got the batteries, boom. Plus you can get rechargeables in AAA if you want that same kind of idea, right? Cons, tracking for 360 degrees will only really shine with 3 cameras. It's totally functional. And again, I want to stress that because I don't want it to sound like I'm saying it doesn't work. It works perfectly fine. It's good, very good. Only if you've tried it on the Vive are you going to notice a slight difference. If you've never tried it on the Vive, you probably won't notice. You'll be happy. Setting up Steam VR compared to Oculus, the touch controllers, not as straightforward as doing it on Oculus. Absolutely not. Next con, not having a 1-to-1 ratio. And what I mean by that is when a developer for the Vive makes a game that has Vive controller support, she knows, there's no debate or question, one of these exists for every Vive sold. Whereas with the touch controllers, at best, the ratio is 0.4, 0.5 to 1. Meaning, potentially every second Rift owner has touch games. So the potential market is going to be smaller, all other things being equal. That is going to be a consideration for some devs on including touch support. Hopefully not, but you got to think over time, some devs, they will proceed based on that. And then the last, as a con, non-rechargeable batteries. If you don't have AAA rechargeables and it's a holiday and you run out of charge and you've raided all your TV remotes, you're screwed. There will be no touchy touch at all. You just can't do it. So that's where it would be a con. All right, guys, hopefully you found this informative. Like I said, I'm going to have a list of the testing that I've done. I'll probably throw up the actual tests, but there's enough of that on the internet showing those examples. But if you want to see it, absolutely can tie that in and upload those as well. All right, guys, cheers as always, and definitely catch you guys on the VR flip side.